All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? It's a little bit after 12:30. Roll call. Well, that's on the agenda. I see all committee members present, so I think we're good. Why don't we stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. I want to thank everyone for being here today for our committee meeting on virtual charter schools. Do we have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved. Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed, same sign. Agenda is passed. So we are very excited today to have a number of special guests with us today here in Indianapolis. And so without further ado, I'd like to just go ahead and invite the first guest up. And I believe that's Veronica Brooks with the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. Ms. Brooks. And thank you again for being here today. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. I'm Veronica Brooks-Wee with the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. I'm the policy director there. We are based in Chicago, but I came today to you from Raleigh, North Carolina, where I work remotely. So just a little bit of background on NACSA before I jump right in. NACSA is an independent nonprofit. We like to think of ourselves as the voice for effective charter school policy and thoughtful charter authorizing practices. So there are a lot of organizations, including a good colleague of mine from the Alliance who will talk from the charter school perspective, but we focus really on the charter authorizer experience. And in terms of this particular topic as it relates to virtual charter schools, in June of 2016, NACSA co-released a report with two other organizations, 50CAN and the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools that I mentioned, that provided specific policy recommendations to help states think through how to hold full-time virtual charter schools accountable for student results. So many of my recommendations today will be based on that report, and if you'd like a copy of that, I'm happy to send a link and get that to you as well. So to be clear, I just want to make sure that it is said up front that NACSA actually believes that virtual charter schools have a real important role to play in the charter sector. So our organization supports full-time virtual schooling, and we've advocated in states across the country to make sure that this option is available to families who need it. So in terms of when we think about what's the good when we think about virtual charter schools? Well, first of all, there's clearly a demand. So not only here in Indiana, but across the country, parents are demanding different options, including virtual charter school as an option for their students. So as of 2014, there were 135 full-time virtual charter schools across our country, serving about 180,000 students. My understanding is that Indiana has 5 charter schools that have quite large enrollment numbers. I could not actually get my hands on an exact number in time for this presentation, but I think that number is quite high in the state. And virtual charter schools offer a lot of flexibility to families. That's why so many of our families choose virtual charter schools. So rural students trying to avoid long bus rides, student athletes who are looking for more flexible schedules, home and hospital-bound youth, and high school students who might be looking for opportunities that allow them more flexibility so they don't drop out. But unfortunately, across the country, there are some results that show that there are significant issues with virtual charter schools that also need to be addressed. So when we look across the country, again, these are national statistics, not statistics here in Indiana, but when we look across the country, Our virtual charter schools are serving significantly more white students and significantly fewer minority students than the typical charter school. They serve more students in poverty, but fewer English language learners. They have much weaker academic growth overall. We can talk a little bit about that more specifically, but when we look at subgroups of students, they have weaker academic growth in all of those subgroups. And then in terms of mobility rates for students, what we see is that actually after a student has enrolled in a virtual charter school, their mobility rate actually goes up as compared to before. So again, these are some issues that we really think need to be addressed in the virtual charter school sector before we can really make sure that virtual charter schools are serving our students well. So I'm going to jump into some policy recommendations. Like I said, many of these policy recommendations come from some of our larger recommendations for virtuals across the country. But the ones that I'll be talking about, I have specifically looked at Indiana's law and found some areas where I think it makes the most sense for Indiana to improve. So there are 6 of them that I'll go over today. The first one is about improving authorizer accountability. So making sure that the entities that oversee charter schools have just as much accountability as the charter schools themselves. The second one I'll talk about is restricting virtuals to serving students who serve students from across the state to statewide jurisdiction. We'll talk about capping authorizing fees, as well as developing accountability provisions that include virtual specific goals. We'll also talk about tying enrollment growth to the fulfillment of performance goals. And the last but not least, the idea of considering transitioning virtual charter schools into other types of public schools so that those schools could perhaps have more flexibility than the traditional charter school would. Okay, so let's talk about authorizer accountability first of all. So the Indiana State Board of Education has the authority to issue consequences for authorizers that fail to close charters that don't meet minimum performance standards. So for example, under current law, an authorizer's ability to open new schools can only be suspended if the state board has closed or transferred authorization of at least 25% of the authorizer's schools. What we would like to see is Indiana revisiting that law and consider strengthening the oversight powers of the State Board of Education so that they would be allowed to do a couple of things. First of all, they could require annual reviews and reporting for all authorizers, not just new ones, as it states in the current law. And specifically, we would want to see that the review would include assessing an authorizer's capacity and ability to authorize full-time virtual charter schools. So we know that this work is hard. Authorizing is a very difficult job, just as running schools are very difficult jobs. And we need to make sure that our authorizers have the capacity to really oversee their schools. And we think in particular, overseeing virtual charter schools is unique. And so we want to make sure that authorizers really have the capacity to do that and do that well, and they understand the needs of their virtual charter schools and the students and the families who go to those virtual charter schools. So, as an example, Minnesota has actually created a performance evaluation system for authorizers. Authorizers are evaluated on their capacity and infrastructure. That counts for about 25% of the authorizer's eval score, as well as their processes and decision making, which represents about 75%. So Indiana could consider moving to some type of annual evaluation system similar to Minnesota, possibly different. Minnesota's system, I am not saying is perfect in any way, shape, or form, but something closer to that than what's currently in the law.
Does their State Board of Education conduct that annual performance review?
The state board staff does, but on behalf of the State Board of Education, yes.
Thanks.
Any other questions about this particular recommendation?
So I have one more question. When you say specifically part of the review should include assessing an authorized capacity, so that's assuming that the charter has already been granted, correct? So it's not part of like an initial approval process.
So it could be both, but this is considering the former.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Okay, so moving on. So the second recommendation is about restricting virtual serving students from multiple districts to entities with statewide jurisdiction and substantial authorizing experience, which is just a really long-winded way of saying that we would like the state to consider changing its rule about who can authorize virtual charter schools. Again, this work is very difficult, and we think that virtual charter schools have a very unique experience as compared to more traditional charter schools, and it's really important that the authorizer understand that and be able to meet those needs. So from experience, smaller authorizers often lack the staff capacity to really handle some of the issues that come up with large virtual schools, especially those that are large and whose enrollment can span multiple districts. Large virtuals can also lead to sort of a too big to fail problem within small authorizers. So for example, if you have a very small authorizer, for example, a small school district that authorizes a virtual charter school that is then going to have enrollments upwards in the thousands, and they are getting an authorizing management fee per student, then there becomes sort of a perverse incentive to keep those schools open, even if they are failing to meet the requirements. We don't see that often, but when we do, it can be very problematic. So again, small authorizers tend not to be able to, I guess, handle, would be one way to think about it, some of the virtual issues that arise. So in terms of our recommendation here, we would say that Indiana should consider changing its law to only allow entities with statewide jurisdiction and substantial authorizing experience to authorize virtual charters. So other entities could potentially apply for this authority, but only after a thorough review by whatever entity was making that decision. So in Indiana's particular case, I think this would make sense for it to be the state charter board. Possibly approve an HEI authorizer. We know that there are HEI, sorry, too many acronyms. There are university authorizers, higher education institutions, HEI. There are several universities in Indiana who we think are actually doing a very good job in terms of authorizing, especially with virtual charter schools. We would not want to see them lose that ability, but instead that they would have to apply for that ability so that it wouldn't be just automatic for all authorizers. Any questions on this one? And just in terms of an example, Oklahoma only allows its statewide virtual charter school board to authorize virtual charters in that state.
Quickly, I don't want to steer too far in this direction as it relates to virtual programs that are operated by a traditional school corporation, but wanted to see if you had a reaction to if NACSA would apply these same types of principles to that model, if you will.
Yeah, bless you. Absolutely. I think that when it comes to virtual charter schools and virtual programming, many of the issues are the same. And so I think many of these recommendations could also be applied to virtual programming within districts. Of course, it would need to look differently to appropriately meet that context. But many of these recommendations that we're talking about today, I think you could actually also consider from a district perspective as well.
Has any other state unwound an authorizer? You know, you say too big to fail. Have you seen that in other places?
I cannot think of any off of the top of my head, although I do think, let me get back to you on that, because there is one state, but I don't want to say it and then it turned out to be incorrect, that has changed its law to only allow, so what they have is they have districts can authorize virtual charter schools, but only if they are enrolling students from within that district, and only statewide entities can authorize statewide enrolled virtual charters. I'll get back to you on which state it is.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Any other questions? Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, recommendation number 3. This one is about authorizing fees. So under the current law, the state board can reduce the 3% admin fee collected by authorizers. And so as was mentioned previously, unfortunately, sometimes large virtuals can lead to that too big to fail situation that I talked about for small authorizers. So the recommendation here is really about Indiana changing its law to allow some more flexibility so that only a 1 to 1.5% administrative fee would be collected by the authorizer for virtual charter schools. So that would reduce some of the incentive to allow virtual enrollment to balloon just for the sake of bringing in funding to the district or to the small authorizer.
Is there any thought, I mean, I want to expand on that or explore that a little bit because, kind of you think of, a fixed cost and there's a fixed cost, initial fixed cost of setting up a virtual charter, of running it. You have to have certain administrative personnel, but at a certain point, there's the cost is not equivalent to just adding one or two, one student. So have any other states considered the idea of, kind of a fee, but, and I'm not saying this super clearly, but looking at what the actual costs of administration are as opposed to just setting a fixed fee that that may not have a correlation to the actual costs of running the virtual charter school?
Sure. So I think that's a slightly different question than what this recommendation is suggesting. So this recommendation is actually about the fee that authorizers charge to virtual charter schools or any charter school actually per pupil fund to run the authorizer's office so that they have the funding they need to build staff and capacity to oversee and monitor the charter schools within their portfolio. I think what you're referencing is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're talking a little bit more about how we fund virtual charter schools in terms of the per pupil funding.
No.
Oh, no.
No,
Okay.
I'm talking specifically about the authorizing fee.
Gotcha.
And saying, you're saying 3%, maybe that comes down to 1 or 1.5%, but still, that's not necessarily directly tied to the actual cost of running the school. So, one organization might be more efficient than the other. So one organization might need 1% and another might be 1.5%. And
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah.
So in other words,
so one authorizer might need more money to build the capacity to oversee a virtual charter
right.
school.
Or they
than
may
another.
choose that because of the special population or special needs of the students that they are educating in their virtual charter, that they need to have certain additional staff on board that would raise that. But so one might be, a lot leaner, and one might be very, either capital intensive or labor intensive in comparison.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And I think that in those cases, there are some states that, for example, start off with an authorizing fee that's slightly higher, and then over time reduce the fee based on a number of different factors. So I think that would probably be where we could start thinking about that. So perhaps for a newer authorizer especially, maybe their fee is closer to 2%, but over time as they've kind of built their staff, as they've built the resources that they need to really oversee their portfolio, they could step back from that. Okay, so recommendation number 4 is about developing accountability provisions that include virtual specific goals. So this is actually something that I think it's possible that the State Board of Education could potentially do without a change to the law. Certainly you would want to discuss this in detail with council, but looking at the state law, it does seem that the state board might be able to implement some of these additional virtual specific standards beyond what's currently required. So, unfortunately, there are a few states that require full-time virtual charter schools to provide really detailed data above what's required for a traditional charter school when thinking about things like student enrollment, and attendance, engagement, achievement, truancy, etc. And what we found, both when talking to authorizers and when talking to virtual charter schools, is both parties saying virtual charter schools are different. Our students are different, the way our schools operate is different, and so we shouldn't necessarily be held to the same standard. And while we think that it's important that the standards be equivalent in terms of rigor, we do think that there should be some flexibility in terms of how those accountability provisions are measured. And so I want to just talk a little bit about some of the provisions that you could potentially consider. So in terms of enrollment and attendance, there are quite a few states where there actually isn't a good definition of how students are accounted for in terms of attendance at virtual charter schools. And so we certainly encourage, if that's not currently part of a performance framework, that authorizers put in some very specific standards around attendance. So for example, in Ohio, students have to log into school at least once every 105 consecutive hours to stay enrolled and be included in their daily attendance counts. Another example is from Pennsylvania, where students are considered absent every day they fail to log into the system for any period of time. We don't really have, NACSA does not have, a sort of hard and fast rule about what this should look like, but we do think that it should be very clear and that all virtual charter schools should be required to meet a very specific attendance and enrollment standard. We also hear from folks that student participation and engagement is difficult. So you'll have some students who are enrolled in a virtual charter and technically they logged in, but they haven't actually been very engaged or been participating. And so when it comes time for testing, it's no surprise that those students tend to do very poorly. And so what we've heard from some virtual charter schools is that it's unfair to sort of count those students towards their accountability when those students clearly weren't engaged. So there are different ways to potentially account for that. 2 examples here. One is allowing virtual schools to track attendance based on student participation and completion of required tasks. So you could have a performance framework, for example, that included an indicator that the virtual charter school could basically check off in terms of how engaged that student was, how many assignments and whatnot did those students actually complete to actually make sure that they are engaged and therefore remain enrolled in the charter school. Colorado does something very similar to that. Another way to think about it, in South Carolina, parents have to actually sign off. So parents are required to verify the number of hours that their students were online and participating. So then let's take a look at academic proficiency and growth. So we want to make sure that when we are comparing schools, that we're comparing apples to apples. And this is true not only of virtual charter schools, but all schools, all public schools, in my personal opinion. And so the recommendation here is that there be some sort of indicator that's really looking at both proficiency and growth and measuring that against other schools with similar populations. That would not necessarily be the only academic score that you would look at. In fact, we would highly encourage it not. But it could be part of the calculation. Again, if you had a very robust performance framework, you could imagine where a certain percentage of the points on that framework would include some sort of indices like this. Illinois actually has an indicator that's very similar to this as well. And then last but not least, grad rates. So again, virtual charter schools tend to serve, I think, slightly different populations, as you saw from one of my beginning slides. And one of the things that we often hear is that virtual schools are serving a disproportionate number of high school students who are behind in terms of credits and credit recovery. And so making sure that we're not just looking at a 4-year graduation rate, but that you consider an extended year graduation rate for eligible seniors. And again, Oklahoma, but there are quite a few other states that are starting to do this as well. Again, not just for virtual charter schools, but for any school that serves a high population of students with that particular need.
Do you have any thoughts on shared accountability as it relates to high school students who are credit deficient and before they join the virtual charters?
Yes. I don't think NACSA has an official stance on this. I will say from personal...
Do you have some personal thoughts?
Yeah, personal thoughts
Okay.
in terms of, I think it's really important that when we think about accountability, that we're making sure that we are rigorous. It's very important that all accountability systems hold schools to very high standards, but that we aren't so inflexible that we are punishing schools for serving some of the highest need students. And so not only for virtual charter schools, but I would say for any sort of alternative school or even a traditional public school that is serving just an incredibly large number of students who might fall into that category, that there should be a set of indicators that we look at when thinking about dropout recovery and extended
So in
grad
our
rates.
school grading formula, we look at graduation rates, but right now, if I'm not mistaken, students, and this is a complaint we hear from virtual charters, is that when the students are coming in, they're so far behind that there's no realistic chance that they're going to graduate within the time frame they need to graduate.
With their cohort, yeah.
Right, exactly. So, but there's no accountability on the public school, the traditional public school that has where they've come from.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So in Louisiana, for example, on their performance framework, and this is my understanding from years ago, so it could be that it's been updated since then. But basically, they kind of account for that by having sort of a high school accountability matrix, and so they look at a student's cohort that they're coming from, and you get a certain amount of points. So on both sides, you get a certain amount of points for bringing in students who are coming in to a cohort that they will not graduate with, and getting that student out within 6 years. And then the school that the student might be coming from technically is losing points or not receiving the full amount of points that they could receive if they have students who don't graduate within that cohort. So kind of on both sides, you're sort of holding the school that's sending the student who's coming in quite behind, holding them accountable because they aren't receiving the full amount of points. But you're also giving credit to the school that's taking the student and getting them through within 6 years. And that's not just for charter schools. That's actually part of their larger accountability framework for all public schools.
I do actually. On the examples, I'm just curious as to the 105 consecutive hours. Is there a reason for 105 that you're aware of? It's such a strange number. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, and actually I think we have someone from Ohio who's going to speak who could
Okay.
probably talk a little bit more about why that specific
Great.
number.
Great.
But I think my understanding is also that they are considering or have already considered dropping that number down because I think they sort of think 105 is
It's an odd,
it's quite a, yeah.
I was curious about it. And then another question I was wondering about, basically, one of the accountability pieces talks about having parents sign off or verify the hours of educational activities. Has there been pushback on requiring parents to really be held to that accountability standard? And I just am not sure that that's the best measure. I can't imagine parents saying that they're not doing what they're supposed to do. So how do you measure that and feel like that's accurate?
Yeah, I think that's a really, it's a tough issue, and I understand sort of the skepticism. I think what we hear, though, from virtual charter schools quite often is that the most important component of a student being successful in a virtual charter is having a very involved parent. And so making sure that you have someone there who really is, aware of what their student is doing and signing off on that is something that we've heard over and over again from virtual charter schools is a key component. But I understand the skepticism. That's why I think it's important that with all of these, it can't just be sort of one and done. You really have to consider these as part of a larger framework that has multiple indicators that you're looking at.
I guess I'm just thinking that would be more important to be part of the engagement and agreement to be enrolled policies versus an accountability policy. But just learning here.
Do you think there should be some students who should not be allowed to go to virtual charter schools?
So I'm about to get to that in just a second, but the short answer is that I think it's a complicated question because the charter school movement, in very large part, was built on the foundation of open enrollment. That charter schools should be open and accessible to all. And so when we start talking about certain students not being able to enroll in a virtual charter school, I think we start getting into territory that personally makes me, and I think a lot of charter advocates, concerned. And that's one of the reasons why, as you'll see in a little bit, that one of our recommendations is actually potentially considering virtual charter schools as something else beyond charter schools. Again, we know that these are very important schools, that there's high demand, that there are families and students who rely very heavily on having access to these schools. But whether or not they should be within the charter component of a statute, perhaps that's something we should give thought to.
Well, and somewhat along that strain, do you think there's a need for a virtual charter school where I'm a parent who's looking for an almost traditional type school for my child who is on track, who just needs a different environment, and my child who is behind and needs credit recovery? And they provide very different types of education. In the same way, you could have brick and mortar schools that do the same thing. I could have a brick and mortar school that provides a K-12 education for my child, and I have a brick and mortar school that provides counseling or credit recovery or opportunities for my child who comes with at risk or needs that would be different. And so are we talking about two different types of systems here?
Yeah, I think we could potentially be talking about two different accountability systems for sure. So again, not just with virtual charter schools, but I think when we think about any sort of alternative school that's serving a very different population than the traditional system, we should very much consider holding those schools accountable in a way that makes sense for them.
So then when you look at that, then do you look at, are we, the possibility of students who enroll need to enroll in a transition type virtual charter school where they can take the credit recovery type classes and then be held accountable in a different manner than the students who are going into a system that is more traditional?
I think it could look like that. I think it really depends on how the system is set up. But I also want to make sure that families have access to the options that they need. And I think, again, it becomes very complicated when we start saying families, this is what we think your student needs, this is where you should go.
Right.
So I would just encourage us to think about all of the nuances there.
Well, without limiting, I guess from my vantage point, the line of reasoning is without limiting choice, but trying to ensure better success.
Right.
Virtual.
And
because you just said yourself that some students are, if their parents aren't involved, then kind of what's the point, if they're not really going to be engaged.
And making sure that those systems have available within them the guide rails and the structure and the faculty that are going to support them enough to help those children be successful, wherein another system, it, again, may be a little less structured and less necessary. Right. Because they have that support at home and it's less necessary.
Can you go back to that
Oh.
context of the good slide? Context of the good, it was one of your first slides. So there it was. So where you have those flexibility bullets down at the bottom, do you feel like those are pretty inclusive of the types of families or options that are needed? Do you feel like those 4 areas broadly cover?
I mean, it would be really hard to say this is what we see in terms of national trends. But there are also a lot of students. One example that's not up there is students who've had really bad bullying experiences in the traditional system. And so this is what I mean, though, in terms of, I think there's just some nuance to think through, because while it does make sense to me, for example, that you might have a bifurcated system for more traditional public schools as compared to whatever falls into the category of alternative, which tends to be sort of a broad scope. But should we have specific schools that are for students who've been bullied? Should we have specific schools for like student athletes? I personally think that that's perhaps not as necessary, and that really it's the accountability piece that we should focus on instead of more on the front side. But certainly, and what I was going to skip to, and we can come back to example 5, but if we skip to example 6, or recommendation 6, one of the things that I think is quite clear is that virtual charter schools are serving different students than non-virtual charters and more traditional schools in a lot of cases. Not in all, but in a lot of cases. And so there could be the thought of transitioning, again, these schools into a different category. And actually, in terms of the example here, I would say look to yourselves, because Indiana has been quite the leader in the country in terms of thinking about different types of schools. So I know that you all have the innovation schools, you have adult dropout recovery programs, you have a number of sort of innovative ways of thinking about schooling and different categories of schooling that I think a lot of other states in the country don't have. And so if anyone could really think about what this could look like in terms of having a separate system or a separate number of rules and statutes for virtual schools, certainly think it's this group here, and sort of thinking about, to your question, actually I think it was your question earlier, Ron, in terms of do we think a lot of these should apply just to virtual charter schools or more broadly to virtual schools in general? And my answer, of course, was we think that a lot of these could apply more broadly. And so you could think about more broadly, what does Indiana want its virtual programs to look like? How do you want to hold those virtual programs accountable? Who are the students who should be allowed to engage and participate?
Do you think we're starting with the wrong question? And what I mean by that is, we keep talking about the virtual schools versus the brick and mortar schools, but is it really about, like, for example, an alternative setting, whether that be in the virtual school or the brick and mortar school, that we need to hold to the same standard?
Yeah, I think it's very possible. I do think that there are some very specific things about virtual schools that makes them just different than a brick and mortar school. So in terms of thinking about alternative accountability, you still might have kind of different categories within that. But I do think, I think you're correct in terms of thinking about this in terms of more broadly, how do we make sure that we're meeting the needs of kids and families in different kinds of schools. So just quickly to go back to recommendation 5, which we kind of skipped over. So this one is about tying enrollment growth to fulfillment of performance goals. Again, this is one of those recommendations that actually could apply not only to virtual charter schools, but to other types of schools as well. But the idea here being that virtual charter school financial viability often relies on quick growth in enrollment, and virtual schools tend to try and increase their enrollment numbers each year much faster than more traditional charter schools, again, because they have very specific needs in virtual settings as compared to brick and mortar settings. And so one of the recommendations that we have is Indiana requiring authorizers in virtual charter schools to create enrollment targets each year as part of the charter contract, and not allowing schools to actually enroll past that number until they've met certain performance targets. And we would say, when we say performance targets, I would actually say that includes academic, most importantly, but also financial and operational. So an example here is Colorado requires virtual charter schools to apply for the ability to expand, and they look at the charter's data from year to year before making those decisions.
So when you say financial, do you mean just how they operate their schools? Is it efficient?
Yeah, and looking at their audits, looking at whatever state LAF guide. I know that not every state has, it's called the same thing, but basically making sure that they're meeting financial expectations of both public schools and nonprofit entities.
Should parental and or student feedback factor into that? And if so, how would that be measured?
It's a great question. I think you could certainly consider that. I know Colorado is also another, or is a good example of that, of a state that includes parental and student feedback in, again, not just for their virtual charter schools, but for all of their public schools as part of the annual grade that a school receives. They have a very specific survey that goes out each year, and you basically get a certain amount of points based on how families and students rate the school on that survey. And so that's part of the larger framework, though, again, of they get points for that, but they also get points from a lot of other indicators. And so again, some of these other indicators that we talked about today, you would want to make sure that those are included.
Any other kind of factors that you would want to measure kind of performance on a year-to-year basis?
Specific to virtual charter schools?
Specific to virtuals, yeah.
I think we covered quite a few of them on this particular list. I think these are some of the most important. But we also actually, NACSA recently put out a primer on virtual charter school accountability and included quite a few other examples of indicators. So I'm happy to share that with you as well.
Yeah.
Quickly, in trying to tie a few of these recommendations together, starting with number 6, I'm sure you're familiar with Indiana's new engagement policy, which allows schools to set up and authorizers to approve a framework through which virtual charter schools can withdraw a student who has failed to meet minimum standards for engagement.
Right.
The challenge that we've heard thus far is that as a charter school, they are then theoretically not compelled to automatically enroll them in a specialized program, for example, that they also operate maybe as a separate school, or enroll them back in their home school or their resident corporation. So would you be comfortable, or when you think about that, what are the things we need to think about if we do go down that path of expanding the authority of a virtual charter school as it relates to the engagement policy, to the extent that if a student is not engaging in the traditional virtual charter setting, if you will, and they have an alternative program with specific supports, that they do have the authority to compel that family or to automatically enroll that family in that charter school. And obviously the family has a choice whether or not they want to stay or whatnot.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think this actually kind of goes beyond the virtual charter school conversation and goes to a larger conversation about making sure that families who do decide that they want another option have access and have priority in other lotteries. And so that takes us into a conversation, which I'm not sure we're ready to have today, but into a conversation about unified enrollment systems within and across authorizers, and making sure that if a student, for example, was dropped from the role of a virtual charter school, for example, but really this is any school, that they would potentially receive priority in other lotteries, so that we can make sure that that student isn't lost in the system.
What would you say are some of the best practices for actually funding students who are in attendance at virtual charters? So, tying that to performance, attendance, et cetera, what month to month, whatever. Are there, because it seems the way we fund it is pretty similar to just charter schools.
Yeah,
So
kind of per
seems to me
pupil.
like it's pretty different.
Money follows the child.
But potentially, we could take a different approach.
Yeah, I do think that it is important that money follows students. So I want to be clear about that. I think in terms of virtual charter schooling, we should look at how much it costs to serve students in virtual settings as compared to brick and mortar settings. I think right now, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Indiana has, it's 90% of the per pupil funding, is that correct? Okay. There are other places where they are considering doing studies on the average cost of virtual schooling, so that they can make sure that the per pupil amount that's going to the school is actually an amount that makes sense. So I think that there is some value in those types of studies. Personally, I wish those types of studies were done not just for virtual charters, but for charters in general, because I think a lot of charter schools aren't receiving the funding that they need to really educate kids well. And so making sure that the right amount is following the child.
I think this is a really important point that you just made. It's one I've been thinking about a lot, which is we don't really have any basis for how we fund students in virtual charters. We have teacher-student ratios, which are different, fixed costs, which can be substantially less. So we don't really understand, what we're just assigning a value and saying, take it.
90% sounds
Right,
great.
right. So, but I think it's important to just understand and acknowledge that there's no real basis in any empirical data, as far as I'm aware, that of what is the cost. And it might be different based on different different schools. But
Yeah, and I think that's where it becomes tricky because you could have one virtual program that is operating very differently than another, and so certainly then you get into somewhat complicated territory of trying to fund you know per per student per school. But I certainly think that there's you could do a study that looks at the average costs of virtual schooling.
I think your next slide is the keep in touch, right? So
Yes, just if you have any questions or any other thoughts, I'm happy to be a thought partner with you all. Like I said, we work very closely with the National Alliance, who you'll also hear from today, and so happy to help as you continue thinking through these.
do we have any other questions? I think I've asked my questions. We will definitely, I'm sure, have follow up with you, but really appreciate your taking the time and coming in today.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Next up, as alluded to, we have the National Coalition for Public School Options. Tilly Elfram?
Yes,
Great. Thank you for being here.
thank you for having me. Let's see here. All right. Well, thank you. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Tilly Elfram, and I serve as president of the National Board for the National Coalition for Public School Options. I want to say thank you again for inviting me to participate today. You may not realize how important this invitation is to me personally as a longtime advocate, but as the president of this organization. Our mission at PSO has always been to promote and protect parent choice in education. And to do that, parents, you have to have a seat at the table for discussions such as these that we're having today. And I can tell you, a lot of the time our biggest challenge is having our voices heard on matters that affect the most precious thing to us, and that's our children. So by providing me this opportunity today to present the parent perspective on virtual education, you are sending a message to thousands of Indiana families and hundreds of thousands of parents nationwide that parent voices are important to you, and you are willing to work alongside us as stakeholders to find solutions to the challenges we face as families that use online education. I say this is important because in my experience of advocacy, the parent perspective is not always appreciated by education policymakers, and even among my friends in the education reform community, some prefer to talk about parents, but not with parents, and to do policy to families and not with families. And there are many who talk about online families and parents and students, and they actively promote policy regarding our schools, and they never talk to us about those policies that they are providing. And my opinion is that you should be talking to the people closest to the situation in the trenches every day. And so with that perspective in mind, again, thank you for the opportunity. I do have some prepared remarks, but I'm really hoping that we can have a conversation as policymakers and just an experienced parent and parent advocate. And so if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. So a little background about the coalition. PSO, we are among the largest parent-led school choice organization in the country. We have chapters in more than 30 states, including a chapter here in Indiana. This past summer, we celebrated our 11th anniversary of our parent advocacy boot camp that we hold in DC. And I'd just like to recognize an Indiana parent who is with us today, Latricia Weber. And she has been with us for many years, and she has 2 children who are enrolled in 2 different virtual school programs here in Indiana. And I'm so grateful for our advocates here on the ground in Indiana. This issue is important to me because I'm very passionate about school choice because I saw the benefits in my own family. And in particular, I'm passionate about online education because I lived it. My son attended virtual schools in 3 different states over the course of 10 years, in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and back in our home state of Colorado. And so, a little background, we sought out an alternative to our zone public school in Pennsylvania after my son's first 3 years of public school were interrupted by teacher strikes. And because of those strikes, I'm not talking about what we recently saw across the country a week or two. At one point, they were out of the classroom for 6 weeks. Teachers didn't return until they were court ordered by a judge. And you can imagine strategically timed strikes over the course of 3 years. Eventually, that's going to affect the quality of education. And this was particularly troublesome for our family because I'm the parent of a child with a learning difference. And we knew pretty early that consistency in a student-centered environment was going to be important for him. And so we started looking out options. And we explored all our options at the time. There were no charter schools in our area. They were predominantly in Philly and Pittsburgh. There was one private school. We were prior military. We were literally just out of the Air Force. September 11th had just happened. My husband lost his job. So a private school education was out of reach for us. And I had lots of friends who encouraged me to do traditional homeschooling. I was public school educated. I think I got a great education, and I really believe in it. And I wanted my son to have the same experience. And I also wanted the accountability. I'm not a teacher by trade, so I had all these questions about traditional homeschooling. Well, at the time, we were at the local library, and I saw a little notice about an info session for something called cyber schools. So we went, and it was in one of those meetings, info sessions that I attended, that the light bulb went on. And I said, this is something I think that we could do. And so we went that first year. JD, we used the IEP established for him in our old school, traditional school. And what we found out is a lot of his struggles were because the curriculum had been dumbed down, the expectations were low, and he was getting nothing out of his education. And so he blew away that IEP in that first year. And as a parent that had a kid that struggled for 3 years in the traditional setting, in a learning support situation, it really was just a miracle to see him come back to a love of learning and to be excited about it. And so to make a 10-year story very short, every year we reevaluated to decide, was this the right option for him? And over the course of those 10 years in 3 different states, we were blessed that his school was in all 3 states. He graduated in May of 2015. He is a straight A student, and I'm just so grateful because I know his success now in higher education is due to the world-class curriculum he had, the ability to use wonderful technology that surpasses what he's been using in higher ed online, and he's been able to develop all the skills he needed as a student with a learning difference to be successful. So I just wanted to give you a little perspective there. That is my school choice story, but we know that the parents choose online learning for many different reasons, and I wanted to just highlight a little bit about the reasons for these choices. And we talked a little bit, the folks from NACSA, about Oklahoma. Oklahoma statewide, let's see, here we go. So the Oklahoma statewide virtual charter school board published a comprehensive study in December of 2017 to better understand the reasons that families are choosing online schools. And that study concludes parents and guardians are drawn to virtual charter schools due partly to negative experiences in prior educational settings and partly to the unique opportunities available to virtual education. And among the top reasons given were 41% listed bullying or threats from their classmates, 34% listed overcrowding or limited resources in their previous schools, 31% listed an opportunity for increased parental involvement, and 31% listed opportunity for acceleration or remediation. When asked to rank these reasons by level of importance, respondents rated students' learning needs, medical needs, and the health and safety of their students as the most significant factors.
So can I just
Yes.
interject real quick? So this is a study that was done in Oklahoma,
In
correct, for the
Oklahoma,
Oklahoma
yes,
students?
surveying Oklahoma virtual families, yes.
And was it kind of just a survey that got sent out and came back? I'm just trying to understand how
Yeah, I
this-
think it was targeted just to
Okay.
families that are utilizing online education. I think there's been some really interesting good things happening in Oklahoma with their virtual school authorizer. They have really taken the time to start getting to know and talk to these families that they're authorizing.
And just so I have a ballpark,
Sure.
do you know how many students the survey?
You
or
know,
how
I
many
don't know
students they
how
have?
many they surveyed.
Okay.
We can get you that information.
Is it in the hundreds or thousands? or-
It's definitely in the thousands. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just wanted a little perspective.
Yes,
that's
sure,
all.
and we will most certainly get you the exact numbers on that. But I think what's great about the Oklahoma is, yeah, somebody's taking the time to ask parents, why did you go this route? And it actually informs just the anecdotal that I hear all across the country. This is not just Oklahoma. I hear this in Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, New Mexico, California. Let's see here. Fortunately, as I mentioned, Oklahoma, they're one of the good examples of what can be good about having a single authorizer, I think. But I'd also like to highlight a few other states who are getting it right. As previously mentioned, my home state of Colorado, the Department of Education has built a model that successfully promotes multiple authorizers. But they've encouraged schools to be innovative and to think outside of the box. And in response, they're competing for students and responding to what families want in an online education experience. For context, in my home state, Colorado has 29 multi-district online schools. 7 of those are charter schools. We also have 11 single district online schools, and then we have 27 single district online programs. So families there have robust choice, and I think the beauty of that is that even within the online model, we know one size doesn't fit all, and so that families can choose the level of engagement that's right for their family. There's like program-specific schools. There's a school that focuses on the arts. There's another program that has a wrestling component. That's kind of the hook that really engages their students to be able to do that. So it's exciting for our families. And when we see in Colorado where schools close or they fail, it's really the market decided. The parents walked. They said this school isn't meeting my needs, and they go and find a better option for their family, in contrast to having some bureaucrat decide or the department picking winners and losers within our movement. So let's see here. Other states have offered also some changes to improve accountability and to build a culture of success in online schools. I know from my conversations with Latricia here and other Indiana parents that the recent engagement law here that's required schools to strengthen intervention policies when a student really is going on the wrong track. Schools here have developed specific teams and programs to be implemented to address the needs of some of those most vulnerable and at-risk students. Iowa also has a new law specific to virtual schools that measures progress towards graduation for students since they enrolled in the virtual school, and that progress is factored into their school accountability rating. I believe this measure better reflects the type of students that attend virtual schools, and it gives proper credit to the schools that are doing the hard work to catch them up. Another state, Ohio, they instituted an onboarding law, and that requires virtual schools to provide parents with regular information needed to make informed decisions about whether enrollment in the online environment is going to be the right fit for their student. We also know from that Oklahoma parent survey that some families, they have difficulty with lifestyle and the behavioral adjustments that come with being successful in the online schooling environment. And those students, they often have initial challenges, understanding the software program and adjusting to the new method of delivery. And while there is absolutely an acclimation period for many students, we believe that more thorough onboarding procedures are setting expectations for new families to help them prepare the parents and the students for the transition to this new way of learning. All right, so those are a few of the successes, but there are also obviously challenges to virtual schools, and those include authorizer pressures, high mobility rates, and the continued emphasis on state test scores for school accountability ratings. One of the fundamental challenges facing online schools is pressure from authorizers who have begun to favor one model in the charter school movement over another. This has often created a hostile environment for online schools and families, and they've developed a system of punitive regulations and restrictions rather than academic support and innovation to meet those challenges. Increasingly, we are seeing authorizers more interested in controlling or even eliminating these schools than supporting them and helping them succeed. This hostility has been encouraged by those hoping to remove virtual schools from the charter movement entirely. For example, the Pennsylvania Department of Education recently placed a denial on all new virtual charters. This unilateral decision, it limits access to would-be families, to families that desperately need the option. And in Nevada, the Charter School Authority, they have worked to silence virtual school parents and students, attempting to deny them their due process by limiting their testimony during hearings such as this, and even going as far to scheduling school closure proceedings on Good Friday at short notice. That is the worst of policy that I've seen across the country. Actions like this from authorizers present a serious challenge to parents, our students, and the teachers that serve them that are desperately looking to make this model successful. I'd like to talk a little bit now about the mobility challenges that we face. The high rate of student mobility, it presents a unique challenge to online schools. A report from the U.S. Government Accountability Office finds that, quote, students who change schools often face challenges due to differences in what is taught, and that mobility was consistently associated with lower achievement. We know this is true for our schools. And I know that you have seen data in previous meetings from authorizers and providers that in Indiana show mobility rates as high as 40% or even more for virtual schools, and that many students are transitioning to the online environment in their junior and senior years. The high rate of mobility and what we define as the school switching effect demands that we create a meaningful system of accountability that more accurately measures student growth and achievement given these challenges. Finally, a recent study from the Evergreen Education Group titled School Accountability in the Digital Age concludes that a single system does not accurately measure all schools, especially with the high rates of mobility or a high number of students who enter the school overage and undercredited. Complicating the accountability discussion is really also, as parents, we see the over-reliance on standardized test scores. We know parents, they are not choosing schools based on test scores because parents and voters, ultimately, they don't trust those test scores to measure quality. They don't see that as necessarily a quality indicator when they're deciding where to send their students. As we've done in many states, our coalition, we conducted a survey of Indiana voters in 2016. And their opinion on standardized testing, it was really powerfully one-sided. Our survey found that only 8% of voters viewed state test scores as an indicator of school quality. 80% of voters prefer a system that measures individual student achievement, and 85% of voters oppose closing a school based on standardized test scores. Additionally, the survey found that 91% of voters believe the best approach to take for underperforming public schools is to keep them open and help them improve. Only 7% of voters believe we should be closing underperforming schools. Again, we can look back to Oklahoma's study and see why parents are choosing virtual schools. It's not because of standardized test scores. When parents evaluate schools and make decisions, those decisions are being made on the personal needs of their student and how each school is meeting those needs. And those are important measurements of school quality to parents. Is their child safe? Are they showing individual growth? Do they have a love of learning? Are they engaged in learning? And my question is, why aren't we measuring those things when we're talking about quality? So, and I think another thing I'd like to just address is sometimes when we're having accountability discussions across the country, I'll hear, you virtual school parents, you don't want testing, which I think is crazy because I think we've seen higher opt-out in the traditional setting, I know in my home state of Colorado. Virtual school families, we are not opposed to testing or accountability. But what we do want is timely and meaningful testing. We want testing that's meaningful to instruction for teachers, and that's going to increase student achievement based on those test scores. What we don't approve of is test scores that are weaponized and used punitively against our schools, or ultimately deciding on closure for our schools. That's why it's critical for us to have frank discussions about the usefulness of standardized testing and how we currently use it to measure the success of schools here in Indiana and across the country. Given the opportunities and challenges in virtual schools, our coalition supports realistic policy considerations to improve these schools without sacrificing expectations for students, parents, and the authorizers. First, we strongly believe in engagement policies that empower schools to intervene when students appear unable or unwilling to engage in online instruction and programs. Again, Indiana, you have implemented a robust engagement law, and we believe this could be a model for other states and schools around the country. As a parent, I appreciate that your state is seeking ways to improve online schools and the experience for our students. I believe that this type of engagement policy reflects our specific needs and supports the parents and students who choose these schools. PSO, we have long advocated for student-centered accountability frameworks for online schools that recognize the unique challenges of the student population, but also sets clear goals for student achievement. A student-centered accountability framework would give more weight to measurements like student growth, course completion, and credits earned towards graduation. We believe these measurements are more meaningful for virtual school accountability and more accurately reflect the hard work of our students and rewards their progress. We also support onboarding laws and policies like that I talked about previously in Ohio, which require online schools to provide a detailed orientation experience that helps parents make informed decisions and prepares students to engage and succeed in an online school environment. Just anecdotally, the 10 years that I was an online parent, every single year I went through orientation. And the schools, if you're doing it right, you're catering it for your newbie families, and you'll have a separate track for your more seasoned parents. And additionally, my son went through his own orientation every single year, and that set him up for realistic expectations and let him know of any changes that might have happened with the curriculum, the learning management system. I think those are really important to set families up for success. And finally, we think policymakers should recognize the importance of retention in online schools. The data indicates a strong correlation between student success and the length of their enrollment. We support policies that would provide a weighted mobility grade for students who have been enrolled at least 2 years, and or an accountability grace period where first-year students do not count towards the A through F rating. We know, yes, there are families like that, mine, that did it for many, many years. We're now graduating students who attended online schools, their kindergarten through 12th grade careers, and that's amazing. But we also realize that online can often be just a temporary stop for students in their academic journey, whether they're facing illness. And I always think about a family precious to me in Tennessee. Their student had leukemia, and his online school was the only consistent thing he had in his life when he was going through treatment. He exited the school and now attends a brick and mortar school. To me, that's a win for virtual schools. We did our job, we did it well, and he's off doing great things now. Or I think about the LGBTQ students that I meet across the country, that they're facing bullying, homelessness, unstable family, and they need sometimes a break from the traditional setting, and this allows them to get the education they need for however short that is. To me, that's a win for our schools and for our students, because we're serving them right where they're at, right where they need us. So these are just a few of the policies from across the country that you may consider in your discussions. And while new policies to improve our schools are welcomed, as a parent, I can tell you there's really only one thing that matters to us. Do these schools work for our students? And for thousands of families in Indiana, that answer to that question is yes. And we know that there are challenges, and we have work to do, but I believe the future is bright for online learning here in Indiana and across the country, and I know we have not seen its full potential reached. But I'm excited to see continuing discussions like this. I encourage you to reach out to your Indiana families so that sometimes when we get in these discussions and we start developing policy and we do it without talking to the teachers, the parents, and the students that do this work every day, we develop policies that don't make sense. And parents can tell you pretty quickly, this will not work for this school, for this particular model. And so I think it will save all of us a lot of heartache if we have these conversations together early, often, and always. Again, I'm so grateful for this opportunity to present the parent perspective on some of these important policy decisions that we're talking about, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Let me just say first off, thank you for being here and appreciate your parent for joining us as well. And we as the board, state board, have heard from a number of parents, and I just want you to know that speaking for myself, that's hugely important to us because err on the side of parents know best. But at the same time, we're trying to explore how do we make the overall education better and ensure that all students are receiving the best quality education that they can, especially since the state, we're spending tens of millions of dollars on virtual charter education. So we just want to make sure that those dollars are being judicially spent, that there are choice and there are options available, but they're good options.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So I don't know if there's any questions.
I would like to follow up a little bit on the incentivized retention. Is that a concept, or is that something that you actually know of happening somewhere right
I think
now?
it's something that we need to work towards. That's, again, I think that's where those strong engagement policies and the onboarding will go a long way into keeping families, and also knowing that, as a long-term family, it can't just be a one-time deal. Those kinds of engagement policies have to be woven throughout the curriculum all year long. And I think when you do that, the families feel more supported. That will go a long way into retaining families, because it's hard work. And, when I talk about parents, I'm talking about the caring adults in kids' lives. Sometimes learning coaches are grandparents, aunties, sometimes it's a neighbor next door. All those folks need those kinds of supports. Let's keep them engaged. And when you do that, you're going to have a more engaged learning coach, which is going to trickle down to an engaged student. And all of that's going to help students stay within the model, as long as they need to. First, like I said, for some, 1 year is good. Others, 12 years is fantastic for them. But it goes a long way if we give them those supports to keep them happy. And communication, schools have to communicate with their students. If there's a change in provider, curriculum, management, administration, whatever those things are, those should be communicated to families prior to re-enrollment. I have a wealth of little tidbits and advice for providers, authorizers that would make the experience, the best it could be for families. And I could be here all day, but I appreciate that question. And yeah, it's something we should work towards for sure.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you being here.
How do you measure success for a student who's in a virtual charter school for, let's say, less than 6 months?
So
I mean, it sounds like it's credit-based.
Yeah, I think there's some different ways that schools could do that. I know, and I'm drawing a blank, but there's states that look at like competencies. So within a course, a kid has to demonstrate different competencies, and that's going to, factor into, is this kid progressing, doing what they need to do and learning what they need to do. So there's some different ways that you can do that. I think when kids are exiting the school, we need to find out, where are they going? Are they going back to their previous school? Are they going to another virtual school? Did they drop out completely out of the system, or did they go on and get a GED? I think there's some things that we need to look at that would help us, like you said, evaluate, is this school good, for this student, even though they were there for 6 months. And you talked a little bit about shared accountability. I'm happy to entertain that thought. I think one of the particular rubs as a parent advocate, and I've said this many times, we feel constantly under attack across the country. And we see, let's be frank here, we see these students that were in the traditional setting, they were failed there, and nobody ever wants to talk about the district principal that calls our heads of school and says, hey, I got a kid for you. And so we get punished on the back end for accepting this kid and doing our best to get them caught up and get them on track for graduation. So I think if there was some shared accountability, and I think for virtual schools, that's a good thing. I think some of our friends in other districts might benefit from that kind of policy as well.
A quick clarifying question. Your data around mobility, just to be certain that we're all clear, that data was across any school type, correct? That mobility impacts student achievement for multiple years after the transition?
Yes, and there's been studies done that looked at private schools as well. We have that school switching effect, and we see that students, when they switch to any kind of new school, whether it's a private voucher school, online school, whenever they make the switch, you will see a decline in test scores, but then the longer they're with the school, those test scores start to go up.
And so then would you expand the solutions that you talked about today, specifically related to virtuals, potentially across all school models who might face a concentrated population of students who have experienced that type of transition?
I think just in discussions with friends across the country in the movement, they talk about the same issue. It affects them the same way. They're getting dinged when they're taking in new students and knowing that, there's a learning curve. If you attended, a school in an large urban district, and then you made the switch to the Catholic school, down the street, it might be a little bit different, and there might be a learning curve there to, get your bearings with a new curriculum, different discipline styles, all of those different expectations.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate your
you.
being here today, and,
Thank you.
and appreciate your presentation.
And I'll just add, I know your conversations are ongoing. Please, we're a resource, and we do have great families here in Indiana that would be happy to talk about kind of the nitty-gritty of what goes on day to day as a full-time online family.
Yeah, I think we may very well take you up on that.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
Thank you.
it. Thank you.
Why don't we just take a 5-minute break, just so people then go do what they need to do. cetera. So we'll take a 5-minute break and we'll be back in 5 minutes, 2:05.
But we also know the federal requirement is to count everything. And so you don't get that 1 year lag. You don't get any lag. So, we have the 162 day requirement. So there's a little bit of proposal. But, if the kid is somewhere for 6 months, they don't count right now in Indiana. Federal requirement doesn't count that.
Right.
If we talk about letting everybody, even brick and mortar, have a 2 year lag, that's
Right.
a lot of kids we're
Right.
going to miss. I mean, a lot of kids we're going to miss. I mean, you've got some schools in inner city schools who are 50% mobility themselves. So you're talking about losing half the kids in IPS to mobility. That's a lot of kids we aren't counting. So then you have to talk about shared accountability because we don't want to lose that many kids.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Their information's interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, I'm so sure. Absolutely. We could go stand outside. It's really warm.
You know, I pulled it up while you were talking. Yeah, so we're good. Thank you again. All right. Why don't we move along to our next presenter from the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, Chad Aldis. Chad, thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.
There we go. See if I can figure out this clicker.
Yep.
All right. Hi, I'm Chad Aldis. I'm with the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. I tried to keep my comments today in the interest of time and trying to be as informational as possible, along with the guidelines that staff gave. So I'm going to go first through just a brief introduction of me, Thomas B. Fordham Institute, so you'll know who's speaking to you, along with our experience in Ohio, which I think is one of the reasons with Ohio's experience with online chartering. By the way, I'll use online and virtual synonymously throughout, so I'm talking about the same thing. Sorry, between different states with different terms, it's tough. So I'll give the brief intro. I'll talk about some of the challenges I see that virtual charter schools themselves face, some of the lessons we've learned from around the country, some opportunities for all states to improve, and then some concrete recommendations that, at least from my knowledge of your situation, I would suggest might be worth considering here in Indiana. All right, so without further ado.
Awesome.
As I said, my name is Chad Aldis. I'm with the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. I lead our policy work in our Columbus, Ohio office. I've been there for almost 5 years. Before that, I worked with the Walton Family Foundation. Spent some time at School Choice Ohio as an advocate for school vouchers and private school choice. And before coming to Ohio almost 10 years ago, I was in Florida at the Florida Department of Education, where I ran at the time the nation's largest voucher program. So, Thomas B. Fordham Institute, we are a 501c3 nonprofit founded in Dayton, current offices in Dayton, Columbus, and Washington, D.C. Basically started as a think tank, lots of research, lots of commentary. Since that time, we've kind of grown. We figured, you can't just write about policy, you actually should try to implement it and advocate for it. So our Columbus office does policy advocacy focused at the state level, and our Dayton office is also a charter school authorizer.
Wait, can you say that one more time? Your
Yeah,
Dayton office?
our Dayton office is a charter school authorizer.
Huh, okay.
In Ohio, nonprofits are able to authorize charter schools. There are about 8 nonprofits in the state of Ohio who do fulfill that role. We support charter schools, but we're also critical at times. And what drives our work in charter schools is quality choices and improved student achievement. So yeah, we are fans of testing. We do believe in accountability and student learning, but we also are critics when the system isn't working quite as it should, and we can get into more of that later. Ohio's experience. Ohio has more than 35,000 students in virtual charter schools, 13 statewide online schools, including, and in addition to some district-specific ones. As early as 2001, only a year or two into Ohio's efforts, the state auditor in the state of Ohio said, I think we have a problem. The way we're funding charter schools based upon participation or based on enrolling in school seems like it could create some problems. There were attempts made at reform over the years. Ohio's tried a number of things. A virtual school moratorium, requirement to develop virtual school standards, which had to be passed 2 or 3 different times before they finally went into place. and enrollment limits, and monitoring and measuring growth within the online sector. Yet struggles continued. In 2016, and this is the thing that probably, if you've been watching the news lately, this is the thing that's probably captured most of the news, and that is the Ohio Department of Education instead of funding online schools based upon enrollment counts, like we fund most schools, actually started looking at participation within the school. So they actually looked at the number of minutes that students were engaged using tracking, either computer tracking or supplemental documentation that the schools kept and provided. And there were lots of litigation that went back and forth about whether this was allowed, whether the department had the power to do that. So I just wanted to lay that out there. At the end of the day, a few weeks ago, the Ohio Supreme Court made a final decision on that and said that the department was acting within its bounds and within Ohio law. And now, obviously, I think people will still be on both sides of that, but the court has ruled. But the net result of that was that Ohio's largest online charter school, the Electronic Classroom of Tomorrow, or ECOT, which had been serving around 15,000 students at its highest, ended up having to repay $60 million of the $108 million it had received for the 2015-16 school year, because for about 55 to 60% of its student enrollment couldn't be verified with participation records. Now, participation records, we can talk more about that later, about whether it's a good policy thing, but I wanted to show you sort of what's going on in Ohio within the context and the framework of the state. I don't think it's a perfect method, but I don't think just simply reporting enrollment is a perfect method either. So trying to navigate those waters, I think, is tricky. But in Ohio, you saw that there was, at least based on that, there were some significant problems. A number of, ECOT has generated the most publicity, but 2 or 3 other much smaller charter schools also had a difficult time. Some of them actually couldn't justify any of their attendance because they weren't keeping sufficient records. Now, I'm not suggesting the students weren't there. I'm not suggesting there was fraud going on. I'm just saying, given the framework, what they had to do to prove they had students in attendance, they weren't able to do that.
Can I ask you a question
Sure.
about that? How do you run a virtual charter school and not be able to track participation?
Yeah.
That seems like the most basic of metrics.
And part of it was, at least what the virtual charter schools said, is that they were doing what had been required for the last decade or more for tracking enrollment. And they said, listen, you put these new requirements on us in the middle of a school year. The meetings that kind of resulted in this came in February of 2016. So they made their arguments to the court that, look, this was after a school year had already begun. Of course, we can't provide documentation for something that was already there. So part of it is their computer system with the keystrokes. Those obviously should be tracked. But it's also, we also need to acknowledge a lot of good learning, even in an online charter school, is going to happen when you've got a book open in front of you, which there aren't keystrokes, where you're writing a paper and doing things that might not necessarily be online, so to speak. So that was the challenge. And
Wait, people write papers? Okay, sorry.
Not as much as we used to, right? All right, so that has been Ohio's experience in the last couple years. We've had 2 years of litigation following that, and then this last June, the Ohio legislature passed some new regulations, including some things that you sort of touched on earlier today. One of the things is they're putting together a study committee made up of legislators to study how best to fund online charter schools, whether it should be enrollment, some measure of participation, or something based on competency or completion, or whether success in some way. Now, we actually, while we want to see changes and we want to see a system that works, we were also very hesitant of the legislature just saying, and this is how you shall do it, without having a really robust fact-finding involving members from the field, because funding in any sector is really tricky, and this being sort of an atypical type model, it's trickier still. So we're glad they're taking the time to get testimony and put this in place, but I did think that was something worth mentioning. Was also the 105-hour rule was mentioned earlier. That was lowered in June to 72 hours. And no, there is nothing nothing magical about that. It'd be nice to have more magical policies that really worked the way we wanted them to, but this is not one of them. I think it was tied initially to, look, if a student doesn't sign in for three and a half weeks, there's a problem. They need to be disenrolled, sort of as it bumped into truancy and other things like that. But I think what we found is that it created a loophole in the online sector that may not have applied elsewhere, where a student could sign in once every 3 weeks and be considered a student in good standing. And when it was funded based upon enrollment, that student could sign in 7 or 8 times a year and generate a full year of school funding. We'll also come back to school funding later because there's some issues what Ohio does a little bit differently, not related to participation, but related to just student counts and things like that are certainly things worth discussing as you're thinking about the best way and your recommendations. All right, that's Ohio's experience. And again, we can come back to that, of course, as questions arise, and I'll be referencing it in some of the lessons learned and things. Framing the issues, challenges facing virtual charter schools. Not the policymakers, not others, but the schools themselves, at least from our perspective, and this is only one person's opinion. One of it, and I'm sure you've heard much about this, is academic performance. Indiana is not an outlier. If you're not happy about some of your online charter schools' performance, you're not an outlier. The Credo study that I'm sure has probably been referenced in prior testimony in November of 2015 found online charter schools all over the country struggled. Some of them struggled mightily. There were little individual schools that you could call that were more successful. And of course, there are questions about methodology and stuff, which we can get into if you'd like to. But it was pretty consistent around the country. Next, state report cards. In most states, the virtual charter schools, and Ohio is no exception, the academic performance is very low, sometimes on both student growth and on overall academic achievement. But that's a challenge facing online charter schools because there's only so long you go, no matter what state you're in, or no matter how school choice friendly the state might be, where you can keep going and having student performance numbers like that before not only political leaders, but community leaders and taxpayers say, wait a second, how well is this working? And figuring that out. Secondly, serving challenged students. You've probably heard, and I know certainly we've heard in Ohio, that online charter schools get a lot of challenged students. Students who've dropped out, bullied, students who have to work a job during the day. No reason to think that's not true, but when I think there's lots of evidence for it. We've got a number of dropout recovery schools that operate in the online type setting too, because it can really work around schedules and things like that. So if that's the case, and that's what you're serving, what supports and things are in place? I think that's a challenge. These are students who haven't been doing well in any other sector. So one of the challenges that virtual charters face is they're drawing students who haven't been successful anywhere else. And so to expect them to all of a sudden have tremendous student performance, I think is a high bar too. So but it's one of the challenges they face. The third kind of combines these two and adds another component, and that's a public relations issue. So you've got these two issues, and then you combine the for-profit, not-for-profit sort of debate and status and the privatization and the corporatization related to charter schools, but especially to sometimes two of the main largest charter school networks happen to be organized as for-profit. As an entity, we don't have any issue about that. It's all about student achievement. For-profit, not-for-profit doesn't matter. If kids are learning and you can figure out a better way, that's completely fine with us. But it is something that adds to some of the PR challenges I think the sector as a whole faces. Moving on, lessons learned. Despite everything we've said about the negative PR, tremendous interest from families. This is clearly an option that's needed. It's one that families have said all over the country that this is very important. We need this flexibility. I think there's an acknowledgement that some families are coming into it for 10 or 12 years of education all the way through, sort of as opting out of the traditional sector. But then there are others who go into it, and we've had this a lot in Ohio, where somebody will go into school for a few months. And maybe it's because they've got a broken leg and they want a really robust online curriculum, and their local school isn't working with them as they see fit. Or maybe it's for a year. My own daughter went to, our school district was being as constrictive as possible with the kindergarten date. My daughter was a September birthday, and in Ohio law, they had a choice of when they could have the age determination date, and she was ready. So she went to kindergarten at Connections Academy in Ohio. Had a great experience. Lots of learning supports in place because mom was there all the time. But that's an example, I think, of the various needs that online charter schools can fulfill, and it varies by individual family. It's also the only choice in many communities. I think a report was released in Indiana a week or two ago from Ed Choice talking about the lack of some of the school choice options, even in a state that's a national leader in providing school choice options. Between charter schools and a robust private school voucher program, you have, Indiana families have a lot of choices, but still in some communities, the only choice is likely going to be online education. So weighing the balance of that and the availability of that is I think, something that's becoming very clear. Online education is only going to grow. This is a reference not to the interest, but to technology. We're doing more and more things online. We're cutting the cables on our cable TV contracts, much to the chagrin of Comcast and others. And but everything is easier now to do online. It's easier to interact. It's easier to be self-sufficient. A lot of individual things are changing such that it's easier to get classes. We've been thinking about it in many states as going full-time online or not, but I think increasingly you're going to see individual courses. There are some vibrant state policies that have course access where you can take 1 or 2 courses and then go to your traditional public school for the other 3 or 4 courses. Some students struggle in an online setting. This is a reference to, I think, this is becoming a lesson that we're all learning too well. The level of student engagement varies widely, and you point back to Ohio's participation numbers. There are kids who are barely signing in, and then there are kids who are going there and getting a fantastic education in a virtual setting. So how do you do that? But it's becoming clear that this isn't just a few kids here or there. You've got sizable numbers probably in both camps, receiving great education and not being well served. And finally, delivering instruction online poses special challenges. The ability to interact when a student isn't engaged is much more limited in an online setting. If Ron is in the back of the room putting his head down on the desk and you're in a traditional classroom, there are levels of interaction you can take. But if they're at a desk in their home, it might be really hard to tell that. And that's just a fundamental difference. I think we're going to get better at that as we go along. But right now, it's not clear that we kind of can know exactly when students are interacting and engaging. Opportunities for improvement. The first thing is something that was referenced earlier about Ohio, that Ohio does, and that is a student orientation course. We've been doing this now for a couple of years. All virtual charters need to offer an orientation course to students. Students are not required to take them. They need to be offered, though. And in general, I think this is the online schools I've talked to have said this has been very helpful. Some folks in Ohio, there's reasons you want to stay in school. Well, one, you've got compulsory attendance. So if high school isn't working out for you and you're struggling, an online school for some folks, they might think, well, this is an easy way of making sure I keep my driver's license, making sure that I stay in school, I'm not violating that without doing much. So this is an important level setting tool for schools to use. We have not had this, and there was some fear when this was first passed, because it was only a couple years ago, that this might be a way of cream skimming or cherry picking to keep certain kids away from the school. And we have not had any complaints or allegations of that. We do have a number of online schools, so if it did happen at one school, there would likely be other options as well. Which isn't condoning it, I'm just saying that it's part of the process. I don't think this has come up to be where kids have been excluded from having options. Another is disenrollment, which I don't need to tell you about because it sounds like this is something that Indiana already has in place when students have excessive absences or fail to engage and participate in classes. It's something I've been pushing to try to get in Ohio, and I guess I'm going to need your advice as to how you were able to get that done, because it's been a struggle to try to achieve in Ohio, but we're still working through that. But the ability, the acknowledgement that learning online, that we need to untie the hands of virtual charters and give them an option when a student isn't participating, to me is clearly in the long-term interest of the student. If a teacher and a school knows a student is not doing anything to engage and learn, then they need to be able to have the opportunity to act. And that's, I think, the strength of that policy. So hopefully more states will be doing that. By the way, I'm happy to pause for questions if there's things.
We'll interject.
All right.
Trust us.
Next up, measuring academic performance. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this because I think this is a critical opportunity for states. And it's going to be one of my recommendations as well. So I'll spend more time on this slide and less on that one. First off, graduation rate. With virtual charters often having a large number of high school students, I think the tendency is to look at the number one high school measuring characteristic, and that is graduation rate. And it would seem pretty clear-cut. The problem we have, and I've been pushing for this change in Ohio, and believe me, we are accountability hawks in a lot of our policies. But the adjusted cohort graduation rate, which is required by federal law, and forgive me, I'll give you the example I give. You may already know this, but just I think it makes the case very clear. So my kids, we live in a suburban school just outside of Columbus. Let's say my daughter is attending school there. She starts as a freshman. She's in that adjusted cohort graduation rate. She's a freshman at that school. They've got about 500 kids in their freshman class. And she goes through the first 3 years. At the end of 3 years, you need 20 credits, by the way, in Ohio to graduate. Let's say she has 6 credits at the end of her junior year. She's not on anyone's track to graduate. At the end of her junior year, she says, you know what, I'm not making progress here. It's not working for me. I'm not performing well. And mom and dad find her a different school to go to, whether that is a different district, a brick and mortar charter school, or an online charter school. As soon as the paperwork is transferred, at least in Ohio, to the school she transferred to, that becomes the student of record. Their freshman class goes from 500 to 499. It's like she never attended that school for those 3 years. And the receiving schools, freshman cohort graduation rate, let's say it was 1,000. It's a big online school. Now it's 1,001. And that school, which is getting a kid that is not going to graduate in 4 years, let alone maybe 5 or 6 years. And that is what, to me, that's a really big problem. So what we've recommended is changing the adjusted cohort graduation rate. We'll probably have to do a federal reporting and say, to make sure you're consistent with federal law, but then to have either an informational or for state accountability purposes, or even for you to be able to tell how good a job a school is doing at getting students through, is making it so that the proportion in the denominator of that graduation calculation rate is based upon the percent of time at the school. And we propose doing it like by semester. So essentially high school would be broken down into 8 component parts. In the example I gave, the suburban school would have a 6 in the denominator for 6 semesters, or a 0.75 of that student's entire educational background. The receiving school would get a 0.25, and then if my daughter graduates, then it goes up to 0.75 in the numerator and 0.25, and everybody gets credit for the amount of time spent. It's not perfect. So maybe you can find a different method. For us, what it would do is more fairly apportion, especially with not only highly mobile schools, or students who go into certain schools, but also make sure we're really seeing which of those schools are making a difference. And I think right now we're not.
What response have you gotten to that proposal?
I think, well, you know, in the legislative process, you don't always know where the red flag. It's nice when you know exactly who's voicing the complaints and concerns. My sense is the virtual charter community has been supportive in the conversations I've had with them. The education chairs appear to be supportive. I think there's a bit of administrative Department of Education level pushback, but I haven't gotten that communicated directly to me. It's hard to pass laws, as it should be, because we pass a lot, and sometimes we need to take it a little slower. So, and this is asking for a major systemic shift. I think there's concern about what the federal government's reaction would be to this sort of change in regards to ESSA. I personally think as long as you're still reporting and giving the feds the information they need, that it can be doable. But I also think it's one of those that's a fight worth having. Because the large online school that I talked about, the electronic classroom of tomorrow, that I didn't actually tell you, it ended up closing. We can talk about more about that in a second if you want to know what the result of that was. But they were being reported as the largest dropout factory in the United States. The New York Times ran a story about them suggesting there's a graduation rate of 33%. Their graduation rate was likely low. They were taking kids that were really far behind, but it was far lower because they were taking kids who were transferring in and late in their junior and senior year who were never going to graduate no matter where they went to school. So it's one thing to gauge performance, but you don't have a measure that you know is flawed where you're saying bad things about them when you know it's not accurate. And I think that's unfortunately under the federal law definition that we've gotten ourselves in a position to.
Is the objection to that there's a better way, or is there we've done it this way forever and we're going to keep doing it that way, or anything else?
No. The only objections I'm aware of at this point are concerns about whether it would be allowable under our state's ESSA plan to be able to do that. I think those are these concerns I'm aware of. But let me say this also. There is right now, the suburban school I had that my kids go to has a 95% graduation rate. We got to be, every policy change influences incentives. Right now, if my daughter had been counseled out, which, by the way, I'm not saying my school ever does that, but if it did, if it said, look, you're behind, you can't catch up, but online you can work at your own pace. You could go to this school and you could catch up. There is that opportunity to say that. Ohio also has over 90 dropout recovery charter schools. So there are also, forget about online, there are brick and mortar charter schools that they could send students to and for our dropout recovery schools, we calculate 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8-year graduation rates. So
you have a separate dropout recovery virtual charter school and brick and mortar?
Yes, we do.
So you have two separate systems, and they have a different accountability system than the traditional schools would have.
Yeah, for the last few years, we've had a different grading system for the dropout recovery charter schools. A virtual school can qualify as dropout recovery as well.
So basically, what you're saying is, boiling it down, is good schools are having problems with potentially their graduation rates being lower than the stellar 95%, et cetera. Is that what it really is all about?
I don't know why the adjusted cohort graduation rate has not yet gained, our suggestion to modify it has not gained traction. I never want to give motives to others and to suggest why something's happening when I don't know it to be a fact. And look, it's a major policy change, so we need to think through it clearly. It is one, though, that we're continuing to think that the current system, based on the example I gave, isn't quite right. So whether you adopt a solution like I'm suggesting, and we've written about it, so we have some extensive blogs describing how it would work and the policy reasons for doing it. Or if you adopt your own, that's fine, I think. But if you're going to hold high schools, who receive a lot of students in their junior and senior year, accountable based on those results, because everyone says, look, we're not afraid of accountability, we just want it to be fair, then this is one of those things that really needs to be grappled with. Because
are there any other models that are being put out there?
None, no other discussion in Ohio that I've heard of. In other states, I'm also not aware. You will have someone from the National Alliance testifying later who might be aware if there's other graduation type models. I mean, most people are feeling hamstrung by the federal definition of it, which that tends to happen with federal law. But we can't let it influence the good governance of schools within our respective states. And it wasn't meant to be, So we need to make sure, especially if we can get a sounder, stronger accountability measure, figuring out how to do that. Next up, mobile students. You've heard a lot about that. So Ohio does a couple things I think that might be helpful in this regard. First off, a student only counts on the state report card for their academic performance if they entered the school before October of during that school year and stayed continuously through that year's state testing period. So if a student enters in December or March, right before the April state tests, the student does not count for state accountability purposes. So that's something where I get a little, because we're not only accountability hawks, but believe that every student's learning matters and you can't afford to give up a year of learning, I get a little concerned, a little worried when we say a student doesn't count for a year or 2 years. Because if you have half of your school that has kids that have been there less than 2 years, you've got a sizable majority of kids who are sometimes cycling in and out. And if you're not looking at the academic performance of those schools, that's a little problematic. To me, this is a bit of a compromise type situation. If somebody's there for you almost the entire year, at least under our general policy parameters and our principles that we try to have, then the school's responsible for the kid's performance for that year. Right now, in many states, they're responsible if they happen to be there on testing day, which is probably not quite as robust a model as we need. So that's one thing we've done. The other thing we've done, not for accountability purposes, but for informational purposes, which is important, especially as authorizers are looking at the success of a school, is we have a mobility impacted growth rate. Ohio uses a very robust student growth model called value added. It's from the SAS model from out of Tennessee. But within that framework, when we have a mobility model, they actually look at kids who've been there multiple years and what was the student growth for those students. Now, it might only be half the students, it might be less than half the students in the school, but certainly it's another piece of information before you would say the school isn't serving anyone well. It would give you another glimpse. Now, that's not part of the state accountability framework, but again, it's available on the state report card sort of as an additional data piece.
Can I ask a quick question related to that point in the Credo study? You mentioned, I don't want to get too deep into the methodology of their research, but would you, or can you give us your expert opinion on how well they captured that in their conclusions? We were all talking about mobility, but when we read that report, would you say that they effectively captured the impact of mobility in their larger conclusions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am personally a fan of Credo's methodology, making the best out of a situation that's imperfect. Obviously, I think you love student level, long-term, longitudinal type data, and they use that. And the way they try to do it with mobility is, they're trying to look at students who have similar characteristics, but if the kid was at the 15th percentile one year, they look at other kids who are at the 15th percentile. And to try to say that your performance is wrapped up into all of your other student characteristics. It's not a gold standard study. It's certainly not perfect. It's not like we do for some of our very high level type voucher studies and some of the like drug trials where you have a control group. Unfortunately, we don't have people volunteering to be in the control group for a lot of these programs because families want the options and they want to go and exercise them. So I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's the best data we have. It's also consistent across lots of different states. And it also, certainly in the brick and mortar sector, brick and mortar charter schools will often have, remember, once you're a switcher, you're more likely to continue to be a switcher because your families are exercising choices. You've seen, it's a long time since I've read the Indiana study that Credo did, but I believe they gained 2.5 months of learning when compared to similar students that remain in traditional public schools. And if that was just one state's records, but if you've got states where the performance is good in maybe traditional charters and online charters, it's not as good, and that's consistent from state to state to state. It was hard for them to find any good ones. It could be a matter of the measurement, but the numbers are what they are, and they also, by the way, reinforce other studies that are being done. They are consistent with state report cards in most states. In Ohio, the value-added numbers, the growth numbers are very low, which are looking at individual students' performances and projecting where they should be based upon their own past performance. So every student is his or her own control group. So, yeah.
One quick follow-up.
Sure.
You mentioned the mobility for informational purposes only. What has been the story thus far? I think it's a relatively new reporting indicator, 2 or 3 years, am I correct?
Yeah, that's correct. There hasn't been a huge story yet. I think online charters tend to do better and all schools tend to do better with kids who've been there a long time. I mean, your prior testimony is exactly right. When students change schools, there tends to be a drop in performance, no matter what school they end up going into. I mean, there's often a reason they switched, and there's an adjustment period. But I also know that it's tough to weigh how you change that compared to what you do with traditional public schools, which also get report cards, and it's hard for them to receive a student in the middle of a year, and yet those systems hold those schools accountable. So balancing that and having good policy. I mean, we have to remember that 20 years ago we didn't care rephrase that. We didn't track, and we weren't always aware of when students were struggling or when certain subgroups of students were struggling. And now we have a much better handle on that, and with that, we have to have responsible policies trying to improve that performance. And so, there's my time. Any more questions on that in terms of measuring academic performance? All right, proper authorizing role. Well, you've already had the expert up here testifying, so I won't add too much on this. I do think it makes sense to have anyone who's sponsoring statewide charter schools to have a statewide framework, scope of reference, and investment in statewide academic performance. In Ohio, this is something we're trying to do. So far, we have not had individual school districts who've chosen to take on a school, but we have had small educational service centers, ESCs, which are sort of regional service entities, who are able to authorize charter schools. And there, they have not done a large online statewide virtual school, but we have had discussions about whether that should be allowed. So that's something, and I think seeing the experience in other states, I think that's certainly an opportunity for states to address that and see what that should look like. Also agree on the too big to fail and the fee structure we've proposed in Ohio, which also has a 3% ability for authorizers to hold back, limiting that to 1.5% with schools that have more than 2,000 students. So far, that has not gained traction. It's one of the reforms we're talking about and discussing. The ECOT, the school I mentioned earlier, after, as you might imagine, after a while, they were not able to repay the funds that they owed the state. They got $60 million that they had to pay back from the 15-16 school year, then another $20 million from the 16-17 school year. So in January of this year, they closed in the middle of the school year with 12,000 students. And those students, of course, went back to a lot of different places, and some of them were never even able to be tracked. So it's not clear where they went after that. But another 3,000 or 4,000 of them went to different online schools, and then some went in districts. Now there were no individual districts that had to open buildings or things like that because they were spread throughout the state. So there was an impact, but that was that was one of the things. Now, would that sponsor ever, or the authorizer? Sorry, we call them sponsors in Ohio. Would the authorizer have ever made the decision to close that school, meaning that they'd probably have to lose half of their staff as an authorizer? It's a challenge that folks face, and there should be some, to your question earlier, Mr. Hendry, about the economies of scale as you get a large number of students. We've put forward that there should be an economy of scale. Fordham as an authorizer, we don't have that many students, and we don't have any online or virtual charter schools. But the highest we charge any of our schools is 2%. And as the schools grow and their academic performance increases, we actually lower that to a lower level. Another thing Ohio has done related to transparency is authorize, and I think you guys already have something like this, but if I were recommending it for other states, making sure that authorizers say how they're spending those dollars. If there are allegations of it being a cash cow or something, making sure that those dollars are detailed. You can spend it how you want, but you need to be transparent about that because these are public funds. And that should be an open book. If you're going to use it to pay transportation costs for some other program or something else that's not improving the quality, of course, being able to give it back to the schools so they could provide additional support services for students they're getting that are struggling would be, in some cases, probably a much better use. And then how to fund. This is what Ohio is debating right now, so hopefully in a few months I'll know more, but it is a big lift. Whether it's enrollment, which is I think the traditional default mechanism, or whether it's participation or competency or completion. Some other states that do competency, the one most people reference is always Florida, which actually does a course-by-course basis in the statewide Florida virtual school. And that's a state-operated school. It's been running for 15 or 20 years since I used to live in Florida. It was there then. And they only get funded when students pass courses. Now, of course, there's incentives and things like that, what it means to pass a course. But it's certainly, presuming all of that is well documented, that's a pretty good basis that could certainly go by. Then if for states that want to consider that, they got to think about what similar policies should similar policies be adopted for traditional public schools or brick and mortar charter schools. And I think those are some difficult policy questions that states have to answer. So that's what makes the question really tough to look into.
So are those options all ors, or is there any conversation that it could be a blend of any of those, that competency and participation, or is it the conversation just one or the other?
No, that's a great question. Our state auditor has been on this issue for a while now and has done a fair bit of research on it. And he had a conference in Columbus, Ohio, back in August of 2016, where he actually posed and said, look, it's time we fund these schools differently. And has discussed possibly doing some sort of hybrid approach, where you would get a base funding amount for on a per student basis, but then additional funding would come based upon on some sort of measure of activity or participation, because there are going to be some fixed costs, of course, that need to be funded. One of the things that I think could be really cool about it is the ability to earn more than a year's worth of credit for students who are really doing well and able to progress. Why not let a school earn more than 1 FTE per year if students are really making progress and really advancing? Aligning the incentives and the funding structure the way we want to see the outcomes to try to more likely get it, instead of just saying based on enrollment, because then you get the outcomes that you're funding. The other thing related to that I wanted to mention, Ohio has funds charter schools based on monthly student counts. So it's different, and I'm not necessarily recommending that to you because it's hard. Our traditional public schools are funded based on 3 student counts per year, October, March, and June. But charter schools actually have a monthly student count. So that applies to our virtual charter schools and our brick and mortar schools. And it's been done for probably a decade or so. And so we've worked out the bugs. Certainly with highly mobile students, it always gives me concern when there's only 1 or 2 student counts. And you keep a student through count day, and then the student is gone. And it doesn't matter to me what sector it is. I'd prefer the money to follow the child, and if you get a kid in November, there should still be money available to fund the student's education, whether the student's in a charter school or a traditional public school. It also it takes away some of the incentives for possible bad acting that can be associated with that. So, all right, and finally, the recommendations. These. If I've done my description well to this point, these will all sound familiar, and that is allow and require a student orientation disenrollment process, adopting a funding mechanism that works with your state context and provides clear incentives. What enrollment duration generates funding, and does student achievement play a role in funding? To me, those are the 2 questions that most need to be answered. And given that I do state level work, I don't like people coming into my state and telling me exactly what I should do. So hopefully this is informational. And if it works for you and your system, that's fantastic. And if we can be helpful in any way, we're happy to. but I also wouldn't presume to say this is the solution for Indiana. The last one is improve academic measures. I do think to make this work, you're probably going to need to apply it to all schools. I think the graduation rate for everyone in the country, given the amount of mobility we have, especially at the high school level, and how schools can actually be incentivized to push challenged kids out under the current framework. And this applies to all schools. As long as there are receiving schools to take them, they win. And that means they might be able to put together in that local school an even better curriculum and credit recovery model. But why do it if you don't need to? And so anyway, and then related to mobility, how to factor that in. The only thing I would say with mobility is, the principle that every year of student learning matters. And when kids give away a year, you need to minimize for any systems of accountability to not properly account for every student's opportunity to learn each and every year. So that's all for me.
All right, do we have any questions? Ron?
You've written about this a little bit, you hit on it, but I wanted to potentially, for the conversation, the principles related to exclusive policies on the front end versus disenrollment policies on the back end. If you could try to elevate the top 2 or 3 things the state should consider, and in thinking about Tilly from Public School Options, as well as NACSA's presentation, what's the relationship there? What would you recommend the state value in those judgment decisions on front end or back end?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what Ron's referencing is we wrote a piece as I was trying to get the student, the disenrollment policies. And a lot of really smart people in Ohio pushed back personally on that about whether, wait a second, aren't charter schools public schools? What do you do? And this is a reflection sort of the broader national debate. And there are some national groups that, again, I also respect who said, listen, online charter schools might not be good options for all kids. And so what do you do in this situation? Where we have come down is that online chartering should be available for everyone to enroll in to give the opportunity for the student to be successful, but untie the hands of the school. And then, again, knowing you're going to hold them accountable for results, fair academic results, but untie their hands so if a student isn't participating, they can disenroll the student. So at the front end, they can have an orientation process to make sure that mom and dad know what the expectations are for the student, what engagement looks like, what it will take to be successful. Because I think I would always get worried that there would be, that sometimes I don't know that we know enough to suggest which student will be most successful in an online sector and which one will not be. And until we know that question and have the research to back that up and answer that question and know what sort of interventions might be necessary to get kids over that line, then I think we should take it very carefully in terms of excluding options there. So what we talked about in terms of some of the principles are, well, yes, it's a public school. We need to take everyone but being able to disenroll students, if you're going to do that, you've got to be able to make sure you have some sort of due process type involvement to make sure that that's in place. Did I cover it? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. All right, so our final presentation is Russ Simnick with the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. Oh, thank you, yeah. Sorry to... Perfect timing.
Perfect.
You got your caffeine and...
Got my caffeine ready to
didn't
go.
bring any for us, but that's okay.
Bat and clean up.
This should be a clip right there.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm here on behalf of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. We're one of the leading nonprofits for the whole charter movement. We focus our work in the areas of federal policy, state policy, research, communications, and data. I'm personally on the state team. Our office is in D.C. However, I'm a lifelong Hoosier and just live a few blocks away from here, so it's very easy for me to get here. Thank you. Also, I want to say that I bring a couple other perspectives to this work too. And the second is, prior to joining the National Alliance, I was president of the Indiana Public Charter Schools Association. So in those years from 2008 to about 2014, I was able to see the Indiana law go from one of the weakest in the country to the absolute strongest, and worked on that policy area quite a bit with some of our champions here. Indiana is a national leader in education and charter school law. We have recognized Speaker Bosman, Chairmans Boehning and Cruz for their work. And I can tell you, as I travel throughout the country and work with different states on improving their laws, when they hear I'm from Indiana, I mean, they're more interested in that than I work for the Alliance, because they want to take what we've done and replicate that. So that's a good thing. But the final perspective that I want to talk about is I'm also a parent of 2 daughters. They've been in charter school systems since a very young age. And for about 3 years, they both attended a virtual blended academy. And so as a parent, I can say clearly that for my oldest daughter, it worked perfectly. For my youngest daughter, it was not a good decision. My oldest daughter, I barely even knew she was going to school because she was going ahead, advancing through the ranks. She's doing fine. My youngest daughter come home every night and work for hours and hours just to catch her up. So it's very difficult as a parent to do that. So while I say we support virtual education, we believe it's a great option for some kids, but we don't believe it's a great option for every kid. And we just want to adjust the policies to make it work for as many kids as possible. In fact, we kind of want to save it, because a lot of states have some auto closure things, and virtuals might not be an option going forward. We want to adjust that policy so it can be a valuable option for some people. So we want to talk about the challenges first. I was asked to do that. There are 3, and you've probably heard some of these before. I'll try not to repeat too much today, although one thing that did hearten me, though, the 3 of us did not coordinate our policy recommendations at all. We didn't talk about our presentations in the least bit, but you'll see a lot of redundancy. First is very low academic performance. Second, I want to talk about enrollment, both in the laws, the way we have them set now, and definitely the scale. And then finally, the wrong financial incentives that are in place. So going to the academic performance, there were 3 big reports on this. Credo, we've talked about that today. I won't go into that in detail, but just pull a couple findings from that. The Center for Reinventing Public Education and Mathematica Policy Research. All 3 of them, detailed surprisingly low performance by most students enrolled in full-time virtual charter schools. From Credo, 17 states were studied. 13 states full-time virtual charter schools performed worse in reading, and 14 performed worse in math. All subgroups, as I think Veronica mentioned, did worse in Credo. But I think that the real bombshell from that report is that second chevron, and that is full-time virtual charter school students experience 180 fewer days of learning in math and 72 fewer days in reading. As we all know, in education, 180 days is about a full school year.
Is that over, what period of time is that over?
1 year. They lose a year for every year. Because they're charter schools, full-time virtual charter schools must by law enroll every student. I will talk about this a little bit later in the policy recommendations. However, the nature is such that they don't work for every student. We found that 88% of virtual schools obtain significantly weaker growth in math and 67% in reading than their traditional peers. That's again from Credo. And that the average full-time virtual charter school student stays for a very short time. And the mobility rates for students after they leave full-time charter schools are extremely high. Full-time virtual charter schools typically provide students with less live teacher contact in a week than students in conventional schools have in a day. Most full-time virtual schools require high levels of student self-motivation as the instruction is delivered asynchronously. Student success really does depend largely on adult involvement in the home, and not every child has that. Therefore, full-time virtuals is a fit for a small percentage of the student population. Highly motivated student like my older daughter, younger daughter not so much, and having that parent home. Both their parents work during the day, but at night we had to be there for them to succeed. And frankly, for some parents, they working a couple jobs like that, they don't have that opportunity. So the issue with enrollment is because of the ease of scaling, virtual charter schools can grow very quickly, serving thousands of students overnight. If a large virtual charter school fails, like ECOT, it can negatively impact thousands of kids. We heard Chad talk about over 12,000 kids, I believe, with ECOT. And that's had a ripple effect with these kids going back to all these different schools, too, and how they're going to be treated on the accountability system. Since most state funding systems are based on enrollment and not the time that students actually stay at the virtual, taxpayers are often paying 100% of per pupil amount for students who are only enrolled for a short period of time. Chad detailed the difficulties with the monthly enrollment, but maybe having more than a couple, 1 or 2 count days a year might be a way for virtuals to get at that. And then we have the wrong financial incentives for both the authorizers and the operators. So from the authorizer, the main source is usually a percentage of that. We've heard that there's just an improper incentive for authorizers to keep large, poorly performing full-time virtual charter schools open. And if they close a school, they can lose significant revenues. So some of these ideas about cutting the percentage down, or maybe even having a cap of a certain dollar amount might be the way to go. But just so that doesn't incentivize them to not pull the trigger on accountability when they need to. And then from the operator standpoint, we have the wrong incentive, again, driven by the enrollment. 1/4 of full-time virtual charter school students account for almost 80% of enrollment. Almost 70% of full-time virtual charter schools are operated by for-profit entities. I want to be clear that we are agnostic between for-profit and not-for-profit, but we are not agnostic between high quality and low quality. As funding is based on a per pupil basis, the incentive is to drive up enrollment numbers. Just one operator alone from their public report spent $37 million per year on advertising.
That's national.
Nationally, correct. With high churn rates, though, the mostly for-profit operators of full-time virtuals receive millions in taxpayer dollars for students who will soon leave for another school. This is from a New Mexico report, very detailed, very strong report, if you haven't read that, on virtual charter schools. It was just put out last year. These are big numbers. I just wanted to use this to underscore that we're talking about two publicly traded companies, which are the two big ones, and we're talking revenues. For one of them is approaching 900 million. In that, it's big money. I'll just direct you to that report to read that. This is from the K-12 annual report. Not beating up on them, but it's just because they're a publicly traded company. This stuff is out there. They're in full disclosure. They report that if those funding levels or formulas are material reduced or modified due to economic conditions or political oppositions, their business, financial condition, and cash flows could be adversely affected. So, along with Veronica's organization, we did put out this call for action almost about exactly 2 years ago now, and in this we'll have some recommendations. And let me just say that I think this isn't on the slide, but I do want to say that I do think that you guys are really at a timely position. Again, Indiana's always been a leader, and I think you guys are leading on this. Since this report's come out, I'm not saying it's because of this report, we've seen a number of states take up action. I just want to call your attention to some of those states. Idaho, their Charter School Commission put all of their virtuals on notice but one, that they've got very strict conditions or they will not be renewed. In New Mexico, they closed one of the big two operators that were working there. Now, I do have to say that just recently, within the last 3 or 4 weeks, there's a temporary stay put on that, but the state did take action to close down one of their largest virtuals. In Ohio, we heard from Chad, we got this new law. They've got to come up with performance-based funding. Look at that by November. So, I expect legislative action soon on that. And in Nevada, after a very contentious multi-year battle between Connections and the state charter authority out there, they came to an agreement where they have very strict enrollment caps. The enrollment caps are tied to performance. As performance improves, then those things can be lifted. But if performance doesn't improve on an annual level, then they will be closed down fairly soon. So Indiana, taking a look at this, you're kind of on the vanguard of that. So back to our report that'll have some recommendations. First recommendation, authorizing. This, I believe, was an Indiana problem. I've been illuminated a little bit more on the current law, but we do believe that only authorizers that have statewide or regional chartering authorities should be able to oversee full-time virtual charter schools that enroll students from more than one district. In other words, if you are a small school district or even a medium-sized school district, you should only be allowed to authorize a virtual program that you get your enrollment from your district and it doesn't go out. Because we've seen problems in other states where operators will go to a small cash-strapped district and all of a sudden they've got a huge program. And oftentimes these districts aren't savvy enough to oversee the virtuals and all that, but they are getting a lot of revenue from that. And that revenue is not always going into oversight, but that revenue is going into other parts of the school. That's not good. Now, I do believe that Indiana law kind of does this vaguely now, but I would recommend that something be put in 2024 that very clearly states that this can't be done anymore. Enrollment. We've heard this before. We do think there should be desired enrollment levels, and only allow schools to grow or not based on academic performance. So it just shouldn't be, the spigot's on completely, just meter it a little bit, tied to performance. And the second point is, I don't want to say controversial, but I'll say it's really new. So we've heard today that it's important that, charter schools have to have open enrollment. We believe that. However, there's nothing that we believe that can stop, and I don't know if this was Chad or Veronica that said this, of creating a new type of entity, possibly more akin to a magnet school. That we do know that these are the certain things, characteristics of student that will succeed in this school. These are the ones that won't, whether it's an aggressive onboarding, whether it's a trial period, or whether it's just to say, you're just not going to be a fit for this school because there is no parent home. We know from your past that your parent told us you're not very motivated to do these things. We just don't think it's going to be a good fit. So moving them out of the charter sector might be one way to get at this, but they would have to, in my estimation, be a completely different entity, again, more akin to like a magnet school. And funding, I believe this is the last point I'll make. There's a couple ways to get at this. Different studies show that the virtuals do require less to teach children, and that amount varies from study to study, but it is significantly less. So one way to do this would be to fund virtual schools based on actual costs, or many states have gone to not many, but a few states have gone to a performance-based model. Utah gives half up front and then half upon successful completion. Minnesota has basically a per course rate if the student passes that. New Hampshire funds based on successful completion of the course. And then Florida, I think they have probably one of the strictest performance-based funding models, is that they actually fund for any course that has a state-sanctioned end-of-course assessment. They have to pass that or they don't get funded for it. And then pending Ohio, we don't know what they're going to do, but at least part of that has to be performance-based as well. And then for additional information, that's the conclusion of that. But I am very happy to answer questions.
Well, I've read your report, so I'm aware of a little bit more detail, so I'd encourage folks to take a look at that as well. Do you all have any questions? I think I'm pretty good.
Can I ask you if you are able, as a representative of charter schools kind of nationally, we've seen some of the larger national operators in the traditional brick and mortar setting. We've seen nonprofit organizations emerge across the country, whether it's regionally or nationally. Can you talk a little bit about access? Why do you or why does Alliance, or what information is out there that would kind of prohibit anyone else from emerging or entering the virtual market, if you will? Because it seemed like some of the comments were relative to revenue, which is directly linked to.
Yeah, I mean, under the current funding schemes that we have across the country and in the state, I don't see anything that would prevent them from doing that. Although I do say that, we've learned over time. Like when I got into this in Indiana had one of the weakest charter school laws in the country. I think we were like almost 30 out of 41 states at the time. Now we're all the way to one. But part of that is really putting some clarity into what are the elements of the application. And we actually in our model law now have come up with some new elements that are virtual specific. And we think that's, we treated charter schools and virtuals the same forever, from funding to every other piece of it. But, we've learned over, 20 plus years of chartering that they're just not the same creature. Some things are similar, but some are very different. So we think that, on the front end, we think that virtuals have to be held, we're not saying to a higher level, but we're saying maybe to different things that they have to put in to do that. And I think that as a nation, we've gotten a little bit better at requiring what we take a look at before we approve a school.
What do you think are some of the reasons why there have been such poor performance that you outlined and Credo and others have outlined? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so I think it's a lot of reasons. I think it's a lot of times it's not a good fit for the student, although sometimes it's a great fit for the student, but a lot of times it's not. I think that possibly it might be for some students a school of last resort. They didn't succeed here and there, so they're going to give this a try. I also think that the way that some of these schools operate, whether it's the heavy reliance on completely independent asynchronous delivery model, Doesn't work for a lot of kids, especially younger kids, especially like my number 2 daughter, who's not as self-directed as number 1. She's still a great kid and student. I also think that if you take a look at some of the virtuals that are really knocking it out of the park, like I would have you look at a school in Idaho called IDEA, I-D-E-A. There's also one in Nevada, but the name escapes me right now. But they are very serious with their parents when they sign up that this is what it's going to take. I know IDEA in Nevada actually takes the separate step of all their teachers actually come to a physical building every day, and they're professionally dressed and they're all together, and they're so when when Idaho sanctioned every one of their schools or put them on notice, that's the only school that wasn't in that list, and they're kind of I'd say an emerging national model. So this can be done very well, but it just has to be done differently.
Do you think there's any issues with the teaching that you've seen?
I am not an expert on that. And I wouldn't even want to come close to comment except for my personal experience with my daughters. I mean, I had fine interactions with the teachers there. I mean, I wish I would have known how far behind one of them was by the time I found out how far behind she was, but I'm not saying that's a national issue or even with any one of these operators we talked about.
What about teaching ratios, teacher-student ratios? Is there an ideal number, or is there a ratio that is too high?
I'm sure there is. I just don't know exactly what that number is. I mean, that's been an area of debate in even brick and mortars for years. What is that right amount? So I wouldn't want to speculate, having not been a virtual school operator. I was an operator of a brick and mortar, so I can have my opinions on those, but not virtual.
Okay.
That's the benefit of going towards the end, that a lot of questions have been asked, so thank you very much for the placement.
No, we appreciate your being here.
It's my pleasure.
And I don't know if we have anything else we want to cover today. I would just give the opportunity to any of the presenters if they have any feedback, whether you've got a couple of minutes now, or please follow up with us, follow up with our staff, and just kind of going forward. That would be appreciated and helpful. So, all right. Well, I think that will wrap up and conclude today's committee meeting. Thank you to all the presenters and everyone else for being here today. We appreciate your time and the effort you made in coming to Indianapolis for some of you, and really pleased to take these presentations. I thought everyone did a really good job, so pleased to have that information shared with us today. Thank you.